so much change all of a sudden. And really what was important then was for people to come together and say, what are the solutions? How can we deal with this current issue, the challenges facing us, but also how do we look forward? How do we build a better education system as a result? There's definitely something about grasping opportunities of change, about making sure we don't lose what we've gleaned during this period. But no matter what, and this is why the National Children's Bureau and Playboard have come together today, because no matter what, actually the most important thing is outcomes for children and young people. And part of that means that that's what all of us have in common today, all the people who have joined this conversation, is about answering that question. How can we reimagine a different future? How do we bring together all of our knowledge from different parts of the system to say, actually it could be different? And we need to think about all the aspects of child well-being, including mental well-being, emotional, social development, their connection with their peers, their parents, the family connection, and of course that all does contribute to achievement as well. So this morning I'm going to introduce a few speakers. Speakers have I've told them about 4 or 5 minutes, trying to keep it as informal as possible, trying to keep this like a conversation. After each speaker, during each speaker, you'll see Owen, who has been incredible setting all of this up for us. We'll be putting up some links in the chat. That's just so really you're not spending your time wondering if people are referring to documents, can we get them? So we're going to be as helpful as possible and make sure all those documents are on the chat. If not, as I say, they'll follow up in a report after this event. So put your questions up. We're going to go through each speaker, and then we're going to go into some breakout rooms that we have randomly allocated you to. That just gives you 10 or 15 minutes in a smaller group, saying what resonates with you, and also if you have any burning questions for the panel when we return. And then we'll return and we'll address some of those burning questions, and if we can't do that this morning, we promise to follow up afterwards. So that's the run of the agenda this morning. I suppose my other tip for you is to remind yourself it's Friday the 19th of June. And this is a time for us to sit back and think about how we could reimagine education. I'm going to start by introducing Dorjee Makovski. You may have seen some of the pre-reading that Dorjee had developed a blog for National Children's Bureau. She's our Assistant Director at NCB, and she leads in all of our practice and participation work. So always at the heart of what Dorjee is thinking and doing is about the needs of children and young people and getting those voices heard. So it was particularly important for us as an organisation to actually sit back and say, well, how could education be different, and how do we put those needs of children first? So over to you, Dorjee. You've got a few minutes to introduce some of your points and we'll start the conversation.
Thanks, Celine. Thanks everybody for making time to join us this morning and for being so active in the chat already. I suppose Celine's referenced the opinion piece that we put out on reimagining education, which had at its heart a proposal or a consideration around looking at the potential to hold children not just in mind but in place in terms of their educational experiences and learning, not presuming that children will have had access or equality of access to the curriculum, learning opportunities or resources around them that would automatically enable them to proceed into the next curricular year. That wasn't about us focusing on curricular elements of the education. That came from a starting point that said if we accept that children are the most vulnerable in our society, they exercise the least independent power or agency, and how we meet and treat children defines us as a society, but it also determines the people they will become and the society they will live in. And if we started there and said from a children's rights and child development perspective, what would our conversations look like? What if we framed them from that wider focus on emotional safety as well as physical safety, on relationships and acknowledging that children live and learn in and through relationships. And our old friend Bronfman Brenner allowed us to say, okay, if the child is at the heart, and we acknowledge that in all of those contacts from the family and school out, there will be impacts of this pandemic that will shape their opportunities, not just at this stage in their school life, but in their long-term physical and mental health. So I suppose I felt that children were absent from the public debate at that stage, and I read a lovely blog from Jack Shonkoff from the Centre for the Developing Child at Harvard, who really challenged my thinking and reminded us that children have gone into this unequal, and they will come out more unequal. The gaps will have widened, and those gaps relate to poverty primarily, but they're about disability, they're about social capital in all kinds of ways for children and their families. And he also asked us to look at the broadest and best available evidence, and I think that's where I'm framing some of this conversation, is the evidence that appears to be driving some of the debate is around acute health, and that's critical, it's important, but there's learning from trauma-informed practice that's relevant here. There's significant learning from disaster recovery, and all of that asks us to hold children, to pause, to reflect, to communicate with them, to acknowledge their behaviours as communication with us, to see the diversity of their experiences and needs, and all of that will take time. That requires our teachers and our parents to feel confident moving forward as well, because dysregulated adults cannot co-regulate children. So that's broadly where we're starting from, and I suppose we looked at what evidence was there. Noel's going to speak to the local evidence that Stranmillis have been leading on, but we know from the Sutton Trust, for example, that the uptake of educational opportunities for children has varied significantly on a class basis largely, but that we have figures of, in England at least, around a third of children accessing online learning. The Education Endowment Fund has also put out great work on this as well, and we have to acknowledge that this isn't just about learning loss, it's about that which is unlearned. So I suppose where I'm coming from is, what we've been thinking about at NCB is we can't set the curricular aside. We're asking for a focus on relationships, allowing children to play, to restore their peer relationships, and to allow those who support them time to identify and therefore respond to their needs on an individual basis. There's great models for that in the Finnish early education system, for example, but in all kinds of the work that's been laid here with Safeguarding Board, Northern Ireland on trauma-informed education as well. So the opportunities are there. The question that I am posing is, is that the starting point for our conversation? What are the other things that are coming into our thinking there when we're asking children at transition phases, for example, to move on? Our primary 7 children, who it might look like a school trip to somebody else, but those months of building their self-esteem and their confidence, their peer relationships, their risk-taking, they're going on their trip, they're somewhere new to be. And the same for our young people leaving education, because we're seeing from University of Ulster study very recently that the expectation or prediction is that our youth unemployment could jump from 8% to around 26%. So are we putting our children and young people into environments where there is a safe, supportive structure in place to meet their needs? Or are we simply running with the status quo, which is it's September and our children need to move on? The concerns that we want to raise are around the level of consciousness with which we're making those decisions in terms of child development, because we run the risk of, by intention or default, locking in inequalities for a generation of children. And it will be the next key stage before we see the impact of having asked them to both catch up, which is an awful term because it implies that the child bears the onus of responsibility there, but to recover their relationships and their learning at the same time while we move ahead at pace with the system, simply because that's the one that was in place before we had to close our schools. And in that, we already had the concerns around class sizes and the needs of children with special educational needs and disabilities in our system. The system was under pressure. So I think I use the term stitch a silver lining, and I think that's what I'd still love us to do. I don't think that the Minister's statement yesterday changes that, because there is clearly a balance here between getting children back into educational and play and supportive opportunities and environments, which is positive for their mental health, balancing that with the physical health of children and families and teachers, but it's what those children will return to. And I think the opportunity remains wide open to us to not just protect them, but to promote and fulfill their rights. And that is the challenge to us, because children's experience of schools are shaping their biology and development and the young people they will become. So no pressure at all.
Thank you so much, Dorjee, for that opening. And I can see in the chat people are enjoying those kind of links, etc., to other documents. And as Dorjee says, it really is about pausing, stopping, being conscious about our decision making. But I have to be really clear that over the past few weeks, my lots of conversations I've been having with policymakers and practitioners is that the common link between all of those is that desire to do our very best for children. And often it's because we've thought we had to do what needs to be done, and this is a real opportunity to grasp. So it's a really interesting time to be involved in this kind of conversation. So I'm hoping people can also put up some of their viewpoints and I suppose opinions on links too, because this is on the chat as well. It's really important to gather all those as we go along. So our next contributor is Helen Dodd, and Helen is Professor of Child Psychology at the University of Reading. Her research focus is on risk factors for children's mental health, particularly anxiety. And I know Helen has worked a lot with Playboard here locally, so we're really delighted to have her on board today and kind of bring us back to basics, give us a bit of perspective about what we know and what the evidence tells us about children's mental health and anxiety, and particularly what could or should be happening during this time and in recovery. Thank you, Helen.
Great, thank you for inviting me to be part of this webinar today. And thanks everybody for joining us. It's really great to see so many people thinking about how we best support our children, and to hear the messages coming from NCB as well. So my background is in mental health, particularly thinking about what puts children at risk for mental health problems and what can we do to try and prevent them from getting to the point where that mental health problem is something that they require treatment for, that they have to go and see a therapist for. And so one of the questions that I've been asked almost daily, and more than any other question over the past few months, is what is lockdown going to do to our children's mental health? And the second question is, what is it going to do to their social and emotional development? And it's rather frustrating that the answer is we don't know, because we haven't been in this situation before. Of course, there's research where children have been in environments where they have been restricted. So, for example, in refugee camps, in juvenile detention centres, but always in those situations, the situation itself is very different to the current situation where, our lives are in many ways very normal, but we're not allowed to go anywhere. So all we can do really is think about, well, what do we know theoretically, and what data are we collecting at the moment, and what's that telling us? So in terms of theory, what we know is that some children right now will probably be happier than they've been in a long time, because they find going to school really difficult. And they find social situations really difficult, and they find social pressure really difficult. And so staying at home where everything is predictable and easy actually means that life is easier for them. So right now, those kids are probably really happy. But the concern with those children is, how do we get them back to school? How do we get them out of lockdown afterwards? And other children, the ones who normally are quite happy to go to school and who really get a lot from their social relationships, will be struggling right now. They'll be feeling lonely, they'll be feeling isolated, they might be feeling sad that they've missed out on things. The children who haven't been able to have a birthday party this year because they've been in lockdown. And also, we mustn't forget the children who are living in really difficult situations at home. So lots of children are in difficult circumstances at the moment, and lots of children's mental health will be affected. So I just had a quick look literally this morning at some data that I collected together with Playboard for Northern Ireland, which was just a survey that we did with parents, and that data shows that 68% of parents felt that their child was feeling lonely. That was about 6 weeks ago. So if they were feeling lonely then, you can imagine how they're feeling now. So I'm really concerned about that, about how lonely children are feeling, and about this length of time that they've had without interaction with their peers. So we know from research that childhood emotional well-being is the #1 predictor of adult life satisfaction. And so I think that child emotional well-being is kind of enough of a goal in itself, but lots of people think that all that matters is what they're going to turn into when they're adults. And if we want happy, satisfied adults, then we need to have children who are emotionally well. And the thing that predicts the least adult life satisfaction is intellectual development. And that tells me exactly where our priorities should be right now. And we need to be thinking about children's emotional well-being before we put any pressure on them in terms of their education and their intellectual development, in order to protect their mental health and allow them to develop into healthy, happy adults. So I've been involved in some research. So I already mentioned the research I've been doing with Playboard, but I'm also involved in a study called the Coast-Based Study, which is being run together with colleagues at the University of Oxford, which is across the UK in a parent survey, and we're also surveying adolescents. And what the data from that survey tells us is that over half of parents are worried about their child's emotional well-being right now. Parents of primary school age children report that during lockdown they've seen an increase in children's emotional, behavioural and attention problems. So the reports from this study are publicly available. I think Erin's going to put the link up in the chat if you're interested in having a look. We also have a report for 2 to 4 year olds, and I think our younger children often get forgotten about entirely with the focus on school. So I would encourage you to go and have a look at those reports in case they're helpful to you. And we're also looking for more families to help with that survey. So if you are able to send out the links via your organisations, that would be great as well. So from my perspective, what children need right now, and as they transition back to school, is an opportunity to play, and in particular, opportunity to play with their friends. So universally, children have been deprived of opportunity to play with their friends. So some children probably are playing more now in terms of, playing on a screen, or playing with toys at home, or playing with a sibling. But all children have been denied opportunity to play with their friends. And 3 months without playing with your friends, you think back to your childhood, can you imagine what that feels like? So I really think that we need to be prioritising that, to allow children the space to redevelop those social relationships. So that's why I joined together with some other mental health experts to write some recommendations, which are known as the Play First recommendations. I'm pleased to say that we did share them, those with officials in Northern Ireland, and had quite a nice positive response. So again, I think Owen's going to share the link, but do have a look at those. So those recommendations are about transitioning back to school, and about prioritising play and emotional wellbeing when you do, and also about thinking about just easing lockdown generally, and that children's play needs to be part of that message and part of that planning, and it shouldn't just be about when we can reopen shops and buy a new car. When can children play with their friends again? So we know from research that play benefits children, particularly when they're under stress. So one example of a study, which I think we'll share the link now to, is a study of children who were in hospital, and it's an intervention study, a randomised control trial. So you've got a group of children who do a free play intervention where they're given time and space to play freely, to choose what they want to play, child-led, child-directed play, and another group of children who just do what they would normally do when they were in hospital. And what they show is that cortisol, which is the stress hormone, decreases in those children who are given opportunity to play. And I think that's a really nice parallel actually to the situation that we're in now, where children are, being deprived of that opportunity to play like they normally do. And that free play will allow their stress levels to come down. And I think if children are going to learn effectively, they have to be ready to do that. So I think, any idea that children are going to be able to not only re-engage with the curriculum in the way that they normally would, but also try and catch up without us focusing first on getting them emotionally and socially ready to do so, I think is nonsense. You know, if we want children to re-engage with school, with their learning, we have to give them space to sort out their emotions about their experiences over the past few months, to reconnect with their friends, to remember how to be in that social situation. Let's take the pressure off them. Let's leave the words catch up to one side. Let's never say them again. Put children's emotional needs first, give them space to play, give them opportunity to be autonomous, do whatever they want to do. And when they're ready, then we get them back into the curriculum at the point that they are and where they need to move on from.
Thank you so much, Helen. Isn't it strange to listen to that, because it makes such perfect sense. And of course, that line that struck me about the importance of emotional well-being of children. If we want satisfied, happy adults, we need children who are emotionally well, and not skipping to that kind of what the results are and the achievement, but knowing that the bedrock of that is emotional well-being. And I suppose the difficulty I have at the moment is that I do feel like we're preaching to the converted. I've no doubt that the hundreds of people in this conversation are all thinking absolutely right, absolutely right. And I think that's really important to acknowledge that this is information that we know. And I suppose the challenge is how to make that happen then in reality. How do we implement that, and how do we not get back into a routine where it is about actually just what the achievement is of those children? Can we agree that we never use that term catch up again then, please, as well? Because you're absolutely right. That implies that the children are behind and they need to get up to where we as adults think they should be. And of course, we know that they need to be emotionally well, first of all. Interesting on the chat as well about that link between the practitioners regulation and the child regulation that Dorjee had started and Helen has picked up on, and lots of agreement and chat there, and reference to the safeguarding board training, which is free for practitioners. Really encourage people to look at the safeguarding board for Northern Ireland's website, really get involved in the training they're offering around trauma-informed practice. This is a good time to stop and think and invest in our own learning as well. So I'm going to move to Noel Purdy now, and this is another strange one, because I would say everyone in this conversation knows Noel, and all for the right reasons, I'm sure, Noel. But for anyone who doesn't know Noel, he is the Director of Research and Scholarship and Head of Education Studies at Stranmillis University College, and he also heads up the Centre for Research and Educational Underachievement. Noel in particular has really informed lots of our conversations over the past few weeks. He's been writing some really interesting blogs, helping us with some ready reckoner infographics just to keep us all on track and say, don't forget the basics. And it's really important to keep hearing those messages and remember that we're building this from a position of strength and knowledge here locally. And actually we have some really fabulous practitioners in Northern Ireland to support this COVID recovery plan. So Noel, over to you to kind of give your viewpoint as well, and kind of reminding us a bit about that achievement gap.
Thank you, Celine, and good morning, everybody. The current pandemic crisis has held up really a mirror, or a looking glass, if you like, to our society. So that we've seen perhaps more clearly than ever before a reflection of the sharp divisions within our broader society, and particularly, of course, within our education system. It's been a bit like those opening lines that you're probably familiar with from Hard Times, Dickens's mid-19th century novel, where he writes, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was a season of light, it was a season of darkness, it was a spring of hope, it was a winter of despair." That's the kind of range of experiences that I think we've encountered during the last 3 months. So the first question I've been asked here is there likely to be an attainment gap, or as I've called it, a lockdown learning gap? And the short answer, a bit like what Helen was saying a few minutes ago, is that of course we don't quite know yet for sure, as we don't have reliable evidence from large-scale assessment tests. They haven't been carried out yet because the children really aren't back to school. And baselining, therefore, will be, of course, very important in September. But let's look at what we do know, because clearly there have been a number of studies carried out during this lockdown period. And first of all, let's not forget the pandemic itself. We know now that people living in the most deprived areas are more than twice as likely to die from coronavirus than those in the most affluent areas. Just this morning, Joseph Rowntree Foundation has released data of a poll where it says that 7 out of 10 families on universal credit or child tax credit have cut back on food and other essentials during lockdown. 6 out of 10 have borrowed money. 5 out of 10 are behind in rent and other bills. So there's a social differentiation that we can see already that's affecting the most disadvantaged children in our society more than others. Second, we know there's a digital divide. It's something that I wrote about in a blog almost at the start of the lockdown period. And that means that children in poverty have less access to the internet and fewer internet-capable devices than their peers. I'm not suggesting that they don't have access at all, but often it might be on a mobile phone. And if you've ever tried to download or read a PDF or try to do some schoolwork with your children on a mobile phone, it's really very challenging. Third, as well as less online access, we know that during lockdown, children from poorer backgrounds have received less parental support, have spent less time learning and submitted less work than their less disadvantaged peers and those attending private schools. And fourth, and this has been referenced already, our own Stramilis report on homeschooling in Northern Ireland during the COVID-19 crisis reported on a survey of over 2,000 parents, and it found wide disparities in parental experiences of homeschooling, often mediated by the level of education and employment status of parents. Our study revealed widely divergent experiences from, on the one hand, confident, highly educated parents who were really relishing the opportunity to spend more time working alongside their children in that beautiful weather we had, particularly in April, safely cocooned from the pandemic threat, right through to, on the other hand, highly stressed working parents struggling to access resources, lacking confidence in their own abilities, battling to motivate children to engage in learning during the nightmare, and that was their term that was used quite frequently, the nightmare of lockdown. So based on those research reports which have been carried on in Northern Ireland and across the UK, it's clear to me anyway that there will undoubtedly be a lockdown learning gap, an attainment gap. And I would suggest that this gap is likely to be wider than a traditional loss of learning which might be experienced over the summer months. So there has been a review of research carried out by the EEF, but it was based on 11 studies which looked at summer learning loss. We don't have previous experience of pandemics on which to base evidence. In a recent blog, I've referred to 5 different types of lockdown learning loss, 2 of which would be customary to the summer learning gap, but 3 of which are particularly related to deficits during lockdown. And these are as follows. Missed lockdown learning, where there was little or no engagement with learning activities by children since March. And of course, that's not the children's fault. And in those cases, I think there is a need actually for catch-up teaching. Shaky lockdown learning, and I think that's an interesting term. It requires consolidation, where lockdown learning has been partial, it's been incomplete, perhaps it's been slightly misunderstood by some children through no fault of their own as well, but it just needs consolidation when children are back and have more access to direct teaching. And thirdly, minimal lockdown learning. And I hear again, I'm speaking as a parent who's been trying to homeschool children over the last three months. Minimal lockdown learning, which needs extension, where children have been doing the basics of particular subjects and most subjects, but they haven't had access to the wide range of differentiated extension activities that would normally be provided in school. So there's a graphic which shows some of the different types of learning. But moving on and very quickly, how do we address this attainment gap? Well, very briefly, and again, I've sketched this out in a blog, which hopefully one will show a link to. It's clear that in September, schools cannot expect to start the new year as they would normally do. This has not been some kind of long, lazy, half-term weekend that we've all enjoyed together. This has been 5.5 months, or will have been 5.5 months of little or no learning for some children. In response, I would suggest that there are 7 key ways to bridge the lockdown learning gap. And they are as follows. And I think very importantly, and as Helen and Deirdre have both said, you know, the pastoral support for children has to come first. So we need to meet that. My background's in pastoral care as well. And, you know, we have to meet the children where they are. We've got to address those issues of anxiety, Some of our children will have been affected by bereavement. They will have lost family relatives, grandparents particularly. Through this, they will be anxious about coming into a school environment which looks very different from what it may have looked before. So that's extremely important. Secondly, I would argue that we need quality blended teaching and learning. The easiest way to address attainment gaps is through what happens in the classroom. And we need effective teaching. Teachers, I think, have been working tremendously hard. They've been thrown into this unforeseen circumstance where they've had to teach remotely with 1 or 2 weeks preparation time. It's been incredibly difficult. I would argue that there's been a lot of focus on IT development, and sometimes, as Celine hinted at the start there, I think we've missed the basics of what good teaching has to be. So yes, it's important that teachers are able to engage with children remotely, but actually let's not forget the basics of good teaching, which is setting out your learning intentions, having engaging materials, providing opportunities for differentiation, providing opportunities for children to submit some work and get formative, prompt feedback from teachers. Those are the basics of teaching that everybody will have learned at Stranmillis or Queen's or Ulster when they were, or St Mary's when they were learning to teach here in Northern Ireland. Those are the basics that we need to retain even in online learning. I'm going to race through these other ones because I'm conscious of time here. Curricular innovation is very important. A couple of my colleagues have written interesting blogs on this. Glenda Walsh on early years teaching and the importance of play, tying in with what Helen has said, and Sharon Jones on curricular innovation and particularly looking at outdoor learning and character education. And I would also make the point here that it's important that we don't lose sight of curricular balance. And the danger is that when everybody comes back in September, and particularly for those P7 classes, is there going to be an unhealthy focus just on literacy and numeracy as we work towards AQE and GL assessment? Is the curriculum going to be skewed in favour of just 1 or 2 narrow areas? Fourthly, I think it's crucially important that teachers have professional learning opportunities through this sort of community of practice that has begun to emerge, and we've had blended NI and other groups of teachers who've done some fantastic work here in Northern Ireland. Fifth and sixth, we do need to address particular issues of children who through no fault of their own have fallen behind or will have fallen behind. So we need focused learning support, we need catch-up tutoring, and we've got to think about how we can do that in an effective way. And finally, I think there are opportunities here to capitalise and maximise this parental engagement. Many of the parents in our survey were saying that they really enjoyed this opportunity, stressed though they were by trying to juggle work and home commitments, but they've enjoyed the opportunity actually to get alongside their children more. And I think there is an opportunity here for us to actually engage more with parents and to keep that momentum going. It hasn't been there in every case. Of course, some parents have struggled with this, but where it has been going, let's maximise that and keep that momentum moving forward. There are a number of pillars, foundations on the right-hand side there you can see, which try to underpin this. And all those are basics to what good teachers are already doing. But the final one I would add is government funding. This crisis has shown us more than ever before that actually there is funding available if the government decide that there's a priority. And I would argue that this surely is a priority moving forward, that we fund education adequately to meet an unprecedented crisis, to allow all children to, or no children to be disadvantaged or disadvantaged more than they already are by the current circumstances. So let's work together in this. Let's be positive about it as well. And let's try to support our children as best possible as we move towards school resuming fully for all children in September.
Thank you so much. And Noah, lots of food for thought in that. And of course, really highlighting the impact of poverty and how this pandemic has really shone a light on the inequalities that we knew were there, but of course are often accentuated more by this. And lots of chat there as well about parental voice and child voice, and understanding as well that children's voices aren't all homogenous. As Helen said, some will have enjoyed this. Some this will maybe really have benefited them and will be quite difficult to re-engage them. And some parents will be wanting this nightmare to end, and others will be saying this is the best time ever. So there isn't a one size fits all. but I think some core principles will really help us all kind of recover over the next few months. Just to let people know that we were due to hear from Brona McKee from Stranmillis as well. I'm sorry to send Brona's apologies this morning. Unfortunately, she's had a close family member take sick very suddenly, so she's unable to attend, but we will send forward some of her links and some of her research as well, and make sure that she's included in the actual report. I'm going to move quickly now into some breakout rooms. I know, having run these kind of webinars before, people always appreciate that time in smaller groups, where you're going to be sent automatically into a group by the world of Zoom and Owen Whitford, who's going to organise it. And in your breakout group, you won't have time to say, introduce yourself, but on your chat, you can say hello, who you are, etc. But I need you to move quickly on to saying, what kind of has resonated for you from what you've heard from our first 3 speakers? Is there something in particular that has struck you? But also, is there a question you can agree amongst your group? Here's a question I'd like to ask that panel. Here's the burning question. So then we come back, I'm going to pull the panel together and try and see what the themes are coming out and see how we can get the best of the final half hour. So you're moving into your breakout rooms now. You'll be automatically pulled out of your breakout rooms probably in about 10 or 15 minutes. And we'll be starting back at the session at about 11 o'clock. So please don't turn off your laptops and go and get a cup of tea. Leave them on. Okay, so we'll see you all in about 10 or 15. Questions popping up? I think there's a few here about the system and the education system. And isn't that an interesting concept? When you think, of course, systems are made up of people like you and me. And the question to our panel to start this is, given what we've heard this morning, how do you think we can encourage or lobby the system to take on board all of this learning about the importance of well-being post-COVID? So any ideas about how do we kind of get this message across loud and clear? Noel, would you like to start with that one?
Yes, certainly. Well, I think systemic changes are going to be the most difficult to make. They're going to take most time, and realistically, we're not going to be able to make broad systemic changes to education between now and the 24th of August or whatever date schools will return in full. So I think we need to be realistic at what we can do in the immediate term. But all's not lost there, because actually I'm a great believer, and I have been throughout my career in teacher education as well, of the professionalism of individual teachers in individual classrooms. And I have every confidence that within individual classrooms, that teachers are already very concerned and put first the well-being of the children that they're working with. So yes, I mean, I think there are great opportunities here to reimagine education, the theme of this webinar, and to look at big, broad systemic changes. But actually, I wouldn't be too despairing if that doesn't happen in the next few weeks, because the focus has to be on an individual level. I'm a great believer in education being about relationship and about teacher and pupil and the dynamic within individual classrooms. And I think that can still happen. And I think within the broader pastoral systems of schools and so on, all of that can happen. I mean, we know, and Deirdre has already referred to, you know, we know about trauma-sensitive approaches, and schools already know about that. And it's about everybody singing off the same hymn sheet, really, isn't it? It's about that trauma-sensitive pastoral ethos of a school, infusing every relationship within the school context. So I would add some reassurance, I suppose, here. I don't think there's going to be broad systemic change by the 24th of August, but I do think teachers can adopt a sensitive, compassionate approach. I suppose, yes, addressing the attainment gap that I've been asked to talk about today, but of course the priority has to be the well-being of the pupils, and putting that first, you know, accepting that some children will not have been able to make academic progress over the last 6 months, but not assuming that we can just start again in September as if nothing had happened. So addressing all of those concerns, but putting the well-being of the child first.
Thank you very much. Noel, Helen, any kind of inspiration or ideas of how we can actually challenge the system? And I suppose this is a good time as well to introduce Dorjee Makovski from Playboard, who's worked a lot with Helen here locally. So Dorjee, you may also want to come in on this one to give any local input on how to challenge and inform the system. Over to you, Helen.
So, I mean, from my perspective, I wish that I knew the answer. So the Play First recommendations that I mentioned when I was presenting earlier, that was one of the reasons for writing those, was to try and kind of lobby government to really stop and think about this. And one of our recommendations was that they make it clear to schools that this is what they should be prioritising, because I feel like it's about giving permission, isn't it? To say, you know what, we're not going to evaluate your school based on how the children's attainment for the at the end of this year. What we might evaluate you on is how well your children are, and just being given permission to prioritise well-being and to accept that children aren't going to be where they might have been, and just take that pressure off the attainment. And so we've done what we can in terms of getting government to support that. The good news for you guys is that the responses, at least in Northern Ireland, were much more positive than anything we got from Westminster. So I think you are somewhat ahead of the curve a little bit there anyway, in terms of how much people are thinking about play. But otherwise, I totally agree with Noel that even if it isn't, there is no systemic change, you can make a choice about how you interact with the children in your care. If you're listening to this and you're a school leader, you can think about the message that you're giving to your staff about how they will interact with the children in their care. And if the teachers unite in agreeing that what we're going to do is put emotional well-being first, then the system kind of doesn't have a choice but to be led by the people working within it. So I think there's a lot to be said for thinking about what you can do locally and your own attitude when you're going back to school for what it is that you're going to prioritise, and whether or not you're going to put pressure on the children in your care to catch up.
Yeah, okay, I think that's a really good point, Helen. A reminder that change starts with us, and actually us as leaders within this system, because the system isn't out there. We actually are part of that system as well, some ownership over that. Okay, that's good. Linked to that is another question coming through about how do we get this message and information across to parents and parental engagement. And of course, it also trickles through to the media, because there's definitely something about the media is playing a key role at the moment, particularly in Northern Ireland, and almost kind of throwing some curveballs, making us all feel guilty one day and not guilty the next, and maybe we're good, we're bad, we're indifferent. We don't know where we are when we listen to the media. So how do we engage better with parents to get the message across to them, but make them continue that engagement, as Noel said, in the child's life and the school life, and actually prioritise that as a relationship as well? Dorjee, did you want to start with a perspective on that?
Yeah, and I think interestingly, this is actually, that is more challenging and more systemic change than that might feel like, because that is not the status quo, that's not the setup. Parental engagement typically is something that schools of their own resource and initiative attempt to wrap around their school, but it's not part of the core system. We've found across our education authorities key practitioners and resources without a remit for reach to parents. Their remit is to the child, or the remit is through the school. So in fact, the messaging to parents, I think, is a bigger challenge for us, because it's true across our education and health system. We have a a position where, in fact, we hold knowledge as specialist. We tend to hold specialist knowledge somewhere up the tiers of responsibility or power. And what we need to do is look at what would happen if, rather than making parents and children wait on referrals, wait on letters, wait on guidance through the minister to the school, to the parent, if we offered reassurance. What would happen if we shared the knowledge that we have with children and parents and treated them as experts in their own lives? So I think those of us who work at community and voluntary level have a responsibility there in terms of translating the brief without taking away from the messaging or dumbing down messaging, is actually empowering parents. But we also have to acknowledge in this circumstance that, like their children, there's a big job here of containment. Those families who are most vulnerable and most disadvantaged, who are, as Noel said earlier, making the decision on whether, who to feed, whether or not to feed children or heat a house, that affects our capacity to think and make good decisions for ourselves and our children. So I think there are layers there in terms of when we talk about parental or child voice. It's not as easy. It's very challenging work. They're not homogenous groups that we're dealing with, and the challenge is to seek, listen and act on their voices. And again, typically within the system, parental voice has not held the same weight as the professional voice. So that's actually, to me, a far bigger and more challenging piece of work, and it's critical. It's part of what we need to consider in terms of how we move the system forward.
Well, can I just come in a wee second?
Yes, of course, Shani.
We ran a very successful parent programme. Dorjee, you probably heard about it, Play Matters. And in the past, when we did parental workshops, especially me with schools, sometimes you would get a very poor turnout. And there'd be a lot of advertising, a lot of invites go out, the newsletters, their websites. But the Play Matters for Parents was definitely one of the most successful ones that we've been involved in regards to the turnout and the interest shown in children's play, and parents wanting to find out more how they could support their children's play. Would it be possible to link such a programme to schools to try and get the buy-in for parents, that they don't sort of damn the schools for they're not doing their academic work, they're not doing their reading and writing, but just they're letting them play? Maybe if we're going to go down a more playful and well-being path, we need to have the parents on that journey with us, to bring them along and understand why schools would be doing it.
Absolutely, Shani, and I think a lot of the conversations this morning have also told us about the opportunity of this online environment. And actually, sometimes this online environment can be even more inclusive. So perhaps parents and families and carers who may have traditionally not wanted to go to the school gates for all sorts of reasons, but actually coming into a Zoom conversation like this may feel more accessible. But also, it's just one part of the toolkit, isn't it? There's not going to be one size fits all, and often we've just treated parents and the kind of community out there as a homogenous group and thought a leaflet or a poster will do it. But actually, we now know, having worked through this the past 12 weeks, that kind of all sorts of communication lines are important. Keep those all up there. I think for me, that's kind of line from Dorjee about treating parents as experts and empowering parents, and I'm actually seeing practitioners and teachers and policymakers as holding specialist knowledge, but they're really, as their role is to share that knowledge and bring parents into the conversations as equal partners. And it isn't easy at all, but I think it's something that we need to make sure stays as part of the overall package when we're thinking of recovery. Helen or Noel, did you want to come in here, or shall I move to the kind of final question?
Just very quickly, just to say, yeah, I think it really requires a power shift in a way, and I think that's been happening through this sort of crisis management that we've had over the last few months. I think there has been something of a power shift, and many parents have actually felt quite empowered. Now, they are stressed. I mean, some of the parents in our survey were saying, one said it's flipping really hard. One of them said, another said, we're muddling through as best we can. And so parents definitely have not found this easy. I haven't met any parents, myself included, who have found working at home and teaching children, or essential workers have had an even harder time, I think, than people who have been working at home. This has not been easy, but there are opportunities here. I mean, 3/4 of the parents in our survey did feel that schools were doing a good or an excellent job. So there is broad support for what schools are doing here. This is not, you know, yes, there were recommendations. Yes, they wanted more live engagement and you know, interaction with their teachers and so on, because their children missed their teachers. So there's a positive there as well. So I just think that there are opportunities here if we can just embrace them moving forward.
Yeah, and I loved Helen's line, permission to prioritise well-being. So Helen, did you want to say something about parental involvement?
Yeah, sorry, this question's going on a bit, but I think I probably have a slightly different perspective on this from a sort of mental health perspective. That, you know, the number one predictor of child anxiety is mother's anxiety. So parents, but mothers in particular. And my sense is that parents are really anxious about sending their children back to school. So as all of you have said, and it's true of my own experience, it's difficult, right? It's difficult working and managing childcare, it's difficult homeschooling, and parents want their kids to go back to school, but not as much as they want their children to be safe. And at the moment, parents aren't convinced that their children are safe. So I think whatever happens, if we want children to be back in school when they reopen, we have to be clear in our messaging, which isn't necessarily our messaging, but it will be some communication from school, but it's also communication in the media and communication from government about the risks to children, about the benefits of being back in school, and about the reasons behind the decisions that have been made, so that parents understand, you know, this is, somebody's thought about this, my child is safe, I will send them to school. Because I think one of the potential outcomes of this is that lots of parents decide not to send their children back to school because they're worried about their child catching COVID, bringing it home, spreading it. They're worried that their child isn't going to be able to socially distance, etc. And I just think that communication with parents is really, really lacking at the moment. I'm obviously in England, not in Northern Ireland, so I'm not sure what the local context is, but definitely here the schools reopened and parents went, I'm not sending my child to school. There's no way. And they just do not trust that children are safe. And I totally think we need to be listening to parents and empowering parents, but I think we need to be a bit careful about empowering parents so much that children don't come back to school. And our data shows that the parents who are most anxious about their children coming back to school are from lower income families. So again, you know, going back to where we started really with this conversation, thinking about inequalities, if going to school becomes a choice, we may widen those inequalities even further. So I think that communication around and reassurance around children's safety is really vital.
It's a really good point, Helen, and a really important reminder to all of us. Some really good, interesting links coming up here on the chat box, and just to reassure people that we will be gathering these together and sending them out to you in a report as part of the dissemination of learning of this conversation. In particular, see people putting up principles of nurture. Again, just a reminder that we have so much learning already happening in Northern Ireland, and I suppose the question is, how can we scale all of this up? People are mentioning incredible years, game-based learning, etc. Some really good community development examples of engaging with parents. So there is definitely something here where people are saying, we do know some really good examples, and it is about actually embedding that and sharing that. And some people here saying the fear is that when we return in September, that a lot of this kind of good conversation will be lost. So let's not do that. I'm going to move on just to the final question here. We've got a few minutes. We promised everyone we'd let you go at 11:30, and we'll deliver on that promise. But before that, I just wanted to ask the panel to kind of, I suppose, finish us with their final thoughts. You know, we've talked about parental engagement, talked about changing the system, about the importance of well-being, social emotional development of children. What is it that you would urge us all to do? The couple of hundred people who are now listening to you now, if you want to say on a Friday at 11:30, if you were to go away and do one thing, is there something that you would say, don't forget about this? Now, who shall I start with? Noel.
Thanks, Elaine. Well, it's hard to limit it to one thing, isn't it? I think all of us, if you could pick one thing, it is, I suppose, to look after our own mental well-being and those of the people around us in terms of our children, those of us who are parents, those of us who are teachers, and it's our colleagues as well as our families. And I think looking after our own mental well-being through this incredible few months that we've had, I think has to be number one. But if I could add a sort of very quick segue to that, speaking as a researcher, I think it's really important that we base our proposals and our plans and our future activities as much as possible on evidence, on research. Now, there's an onus on us as researchers to carry out useful research, that's relevant to practice, but also to get it out there. And we have been trying very hard to do that, and I know others have as well during this crisis, to get our research out there, to make an impact and to try and help schools and teachers and parents to move forward based on evidence rather than on hunches. So that would be my two. Sorry, I had to give two key tips.
Okay, thank you, Noel, and I'm glad you started with think of ourselves first, because I really appreciate that there's lots of practitioners out there who haven't stopped working during this period, and have been really keep it an infrastructure of keeping things going. Dorjee.
Thanks, Celine. I suppose I'm thinking as I hear people talk and I'm looking at the chat that I want to remind ourselves that many of these commitments are made. It might feel like a conversation among, a coalition of the willing, or those of us that are specifically focused on emotional learning and feel that we'll end up back in a very academic and curricular space. But our programme for government, our department's commitment to transformation, our Department of Health's mental health action plan, our investments in infant mental health and in our play-based curriculum, those commitments are in place. And I think this is not just a time to hold that power to account, but to support the fulfillment of those commitments and that potential. And I suppose it actually this morning has made me think more around the curricular pause and how conscious and deliberate we need to be in creating a space within our schools that will allow relationships and emotional well-being and that broader sense of security and nurture to happen in our schools. And I suppose I leave with the same question that I started with, which is, are we willing to take the chance? Because we're living in times when the word privilege has never meant more. And I think that's a challenge to us to say, are we consciously part of reinforcing a system of privilege where those children with the most independent and social network resource will continue to flourish, and the gap for those children who we already know to be or becoming vulnerable, that they will be left behind. And I think that's a huge challenge for us, but I could have flipped it and said that first and said the opportunities and commitments are there, but I think we have to hold that word in mind and our part in maintaining or breaking cycles of privilege.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dorjee. Helen.
So I think for me, I would urge everybody working with children to remember that returning to school is going to be a huge transition. For many of them, one of the biggest transitions that they will have had, because even when they started school, most of them would have been in some kind of childcare or nursery setting before that. 5.5 months at home, however long it's going to be, then going back to school is a massive transition. And every child is, unique anyway, but those differences between children will be greater than they may have been before. So children will react to that transition differently. They will have had different experiences at home. They will have had different experiences of the virus, of lockdown. They'll have had different home schooling experiences. So really to keep in mind the individual child and what each child needs and meeting those needs. So for some children, it may be that they need some structure and they will need to get back into some academic work. And for others, it will be that they really don't need that. They really need to recover from a trauma, difficult period. But for all children, it will be a transition. So let's, use what we know about transitioning children into school in the first place and treat all children in that same way, where they're given some space and time to play and get used to being in this new context before we put that academic pressure back on them.
Thank you. Those are really important, strong points to end on. And I can say really appreciated by everyone commenting in the chat. Owen is going to put up a link now to a bit of feedback, bit of evaluation, so we can hear more from you and what you think about the conversation this morning. And just a reminder, we will be pulling all these thoughts together, sending them to the Department of Education, but also sharing them with yourselves. As many people have said in the chat, collaboration is key. This one debate isn't owned by one organisation or one school or one policymaker. We're absolutely all in this together. So just while I'm waiting on Owen to put up the link to the survey, I can see it there. Brilliant. Your job now, because you're here and we won't let you go off this chat, is just to click on that link. And if you wouldn't mind filling it in while you're here before leaving us. And I just want to finish with just a final thought. And I'm sure you've all seen this on Twitter. I know it isn't Marcus, the footballer, asking for more money during the summer, but it's a poem about 2020 and saying, what if 2020 isn't cancelled? What if 2020 is the year that we have been waiting for? A year so uncomfortable, so painful, so scary, so raw, that it finally forces us to grow. A year that screams so loud, finally awakening us from our ignorant slumber. A year that we finally accept the need for change, that we declare change and we work for change and we become the change. A year we finally band together instead of pushing each other apart. 2020 isn't cancelled, but rather this is the most important year of them all. And I would just leave those thoughts with you, that in the midst of the panic and despair and the what are we going to do, realise that you're all part of the solution. And actually it's only by bearing that in mind and saying, actually we know what we're doing. We're doing good stuff here, but actually we just need to do more of it and embed it. And we are the system. They aren't them, it's actually us. We're part of that. So thank you so much to our speakers, giving up our time this morning for that conversation. Thanks to our partners at Playboard for supporting this agenda and making sure we brought some good conversations together. And thank you all for filling out the evaluation form. And of course, as you know, the biggest thank you is to Owen Whitford, who behind the scenes has done some great IT work this morning. And we all really appreciate that. So you'll be hearing more from us, and please don't hesitate to give us an email or anything if there's anything else you'd like to raise that you haven't had a chance to do so this morning. Everybody wants to put their camera on now so we can see everybody and do a big wave on a Friday, and everybody take care for the weekend.
Bye.
Bye everyone. Bye. Bye.